So that's an interesting question, and I'm glad to give you sort of my personal reflection of what happened to me and how I did it. And it's only one way, but it's kind of a recipe for research that I've seen work. I learned it from somebody else who'd done it before me, and I've passed it on and seen it work several times. So I think it's a good recipe, and it seems to work in different continents. So I think the thing which I'd like to start off by saying is that I think there's a disparity between perhaps how research is looked at, and between those of us who stay in academic hospitals and those of us who go and work in community hospitals. And I think that's a false disparity which shouldn't exist. We all go through the same residency training. We all go through the same programs, and yet the minute you graduate and you go into the community, does that mean the end of your inquiring mind, the end of your ability to do research? And there's no difference between the person who goes through the residency or not, just that the emphasis that they're going to put on the different parts of their professional lives might be different, but it doesn't mean that it should stop when a practitioner goes into the community practice. So I think a lot of what I would say would apply to those of us who see us more as community obstetricians than academics. So it's the proportion of emphasis that one would place on so-called research rather than the absence of it. And at least that's what I would hope. The second point I would make is research has got many hats and very forms. There is basic science research, which is laboratory, wet bench. There's epidemiology, which is paper review, randomized trials, and cohort. There's quality improvement, which I think is a relatively new field, but it's something which all of us are keen to do. We all want to do what's best for our moms and our families, and that's by implementing quality improvements. And when you do that in a way that you measure the outcome, you're doing research. And this is everybody's business. It's not just the academic obstetrician. So I remember when I first walked onto my first ward as a resident back in the UK, I met the professor, and the first thing he said to me is, "What's your research project?" So I said, "Oh, I don't know," because it was my first day. I didn't know anything, and the first question I get asked is, "What's your research project?" So I said, I didn't know. He said, "Well, why didn't you do a randomized trial on whether to rupture a woman's membranes in labor or not?" So I said, okay. So we proceeded to do that. It was probably the worst randomized trial I'd ever done, because it was done using opaque envelopes, which allocated the people to different groups. And after halfway through the trial, we realized that the nurses were holding up the envelope to the light to see which group the patient was in. If they didn't like it, they'd put it back. So anyway, it got published. But it was enough to set the scene for me to realize a couple of things, which I think is part of the recipe, is that, as I said before, research is part of what we do wherever we are. And just maybe as I say, the amount of time we dedicate might be different, but it's a normal process, and it's a question whenever I meet a resident for the first time, you can ask my residents, it's the first question I ask them: what is your research project? And they look at me as if I'm crazy, like I must have looked at the professor. But some people it sticks, and they think, oh, like, what is my project? What have you got to do? So I think the next thing is to say, okay, so if research is going to be part of what I do, choose something that's one of two things. Choose something that really interests you, that's your passion, in a clinical field, because most of us go into this area because we love obstetrics or gynecology or the clinical practice of it, and we have patients with a clinical kind of problem or issue that needs to be addressed. And the second thing is to choose something which has an impact that's important. And so an example, so for the project, rupturing membranes in labor, this is something we do on every labor. So it's important and it's common. I wouldn't say at that stage labor management was my main interest, but it's a very common thing. But when I came on staff, and because of my background from my first professor of saying, what's your research project, it already become integrated as part of my work, that I always would have something going on related to something that I was doing. So when the question that I was sat down, it was Jerry Scheim, who was the chief of gynecology at Women's College when I came on staff. Jerry said to me, what are you going to do when you come on staff? So I said, I don't know, high-risk pregnancy. He says, no, that's no good. Choose a focus. Choose something that's a focus. So I said, okay, what do you think? So he said, well, why don't you investigate twins? I said, yeah, that's interesting. Why do you think that? He said, well, there's a lot of them around these days. So yeah, he was right. This was the early stage of in vitro fertilization success, where there was a rapidly increasing incidence of multiple pregnancy. So with that guidance and mentorship, really, I chose something that was common, that I was interested in, which is the first ingredient in your research recipe. Choose something that's common and that you're interested in. And then the third ingredient is, an experienced chef who's been there before. So a mentor of someone who's done this before, who understands the way that the academia and research works, or that hospitals work, or that universities work. Someone is a mentor who can help you. So I think it's really important, that mentorship relationship. Find someone who you trust, who you like, who's done this before, and then choose something that's common, that's got a clinical impact. Don't choose something that nobody ever sees as being your focus, because it's less likely, not completely impossible, to make your impact. Some of us do make impact on very rare diseases by becoming the expert in that very rare disease. So you can, as long as so that's why there's two ingredients. It's got to be common. It doesn't have to be common, but it's got to interest you. So one of my colleagues, Dr. Anne Berndl, who came on staff at Sunnybrook, I said to her, what interests you? She says, I'm really interested in women with disabilities. So I said, right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start a clinic of women with disabilities. And she said, well, there's not that many of them. I said, it doesn't matter. It's a focus, it's a clinical focus. So I started my twins clinic, and there were lots of twins. There are, thank God, not that many women with disabilities, but it's a specific focus that there is no such clinical service for this woman in Canada. In fact, I don't think in the world there is a special clinic for women with disabilities. And Anne was interested in it, so I said to her, start that clinic. And now this clinic, which Anne started a while ago, is very successful, and she's giving talks internationally because she chose an area that was of interest to her, and that we could focus and have a clinical use. That's the first part of the ingredient. The second part really is to become an expert in that clinical area in your own region first. So for my personal experience, so I started a twins clinic. And very soon I was a twin expert because I had a twins clinic. I promise you, I wasn't doing anything in that clinic that any other high-risk obstetrician wasn't doing in their practice anywhere in Canada. There was nothing special about me. I didn't know anything more. I just had a focused area, so I became the local expert in twins. The next thing I think is important, it's to extend your recognition from beyond your local area, city, nationally, and then internationally. And nationally, that's where I believe the SOGC has an important role in allowing people who've developed local expertise with mentorship to go into the national stage through presentation at first regional meetings and then national meetings. And so the SOGC, the way that it started with us was simply by surveys. When you give a research surveys of what are the priorities, and the SOGC is so amenable and helpful to people to do that by presentations, by volunteering on committees. And so in my case, I was interested in twins, and there were a problem everywhere, so I went to the SOGC and I said, how about we form a twins subcommittee and the SOGC said, great. So we formed a subcommittee. So all of a sudden I was a national expert, not by doing anything, just by putting a profile up. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Now, while you're doing that, I think it's important to do some actual research. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to do a randomized trial first. In fact, you can't. You won't get the funding for a randomized trial. But you can do very simple patient-level audit. One of our first projects I did with a young junior colleague of mine who's now a staff Richard Pettini, was just to look at the patients that were referred in to us at Women's College with twins, and we found that most of them didn't have ultrasound available, and that the ultrasound that they had didn't show things like chorionicity. So when we start doing simple chart audits, you get some idea of where the gaps in care are, and then you start designing things like a patient carried record, which we designed to fill in those gaps. And then with mentorship, people who've done it before, you can start doing local chart reviews, and you do retrospective cohort studies, answering simple basic questions. What are the outcomes of twins at your gestation? And at what, or do twins do worse than singletons? And most of us who work in larger centers have got this data ready available. So when you start doing these retrospective local studies, they build up into more and more, along with what you've been doing nationally and on your SOGC profile, you're becoming more and more recognized as a person with an interest and expertise in that particular project. One of the things I want to highlight is the use of data and databases that can help you. So find somebody, if you've got data, if you've got knowledge, you have power. So if you find somebody in your area where you are who's got data, in Ontario we have a database from a provincial database of Born, but most places around Canada there are data repositories. Find people who are in that data repositories who can get data out, and they're so willing and helpful if you just give them the clinical question to help you get the data out, and it doesn't have to be hugely expensive in terms of studies to do that. Now, while you're doing this, while you're building a career, if I had to do it again, I would do what I'm trying to do now in our unit, is to make sure that the cook who's doing this recipe has protected time to do it. Most often, at least in times past, and maybe even today, the young researcher doesn't give himself time to do it. And in fact, in many cases, the time of a researcher was not compensated the same as the time of a clinician. And I think that is something that we need to do as people who've been there before, to make sure that we compensate research time, and that you as the young investigator, if you're following this recipe, should be demanding that if you want me to produce, I need the time and resources available to do it. And for us, the chiefs and chairmen of the hospitals, if we want our junior faculty to cook, we have to give them the space, we have to give them the recipe, we have to give them the time to do this. And then I think, once you develop this expertise and you have this cohort studies, you can then go on to start submitting for grant money, because you've got the track record, so the agencies will start looking at you seriously. But there again, I can't emphasize it enough, the ability to work in a team with people who are experienced, who've got a name, who know how to do this is very important. To start to do this in isolation, without people who've done it before, without a team, is virtually impossible. So in my situation, I was very fortunate. I worked in a center with a history of randomized trials. Mary Hannah was my mentor. She'd done trials. So when I went to her with twins, and I said, I'd already had a twins clinic. I'd already done papers. The expertise of Mary's unit was there for me, ready to do it. I've forgotten one important recipe, one important ingredient. It goes along with the SOGC, and that's the SOGC consensus statement or a guideline. There's nothing like establishing your career and your stamp in your academic career as to be an author on a consensus guideline, because as soon as you do that, nationally and internationally, you are that person. So when you then write your research grant for a randomized trial or whatever it is, you've already got a track record of people looking after you and saying who you are. So then, once you've got that, and it's not an easy step, funding is becoming harder and harder. I think we still have to keep on trying for it, and working in teams is good. Collaboration is important to get these big grants. I think you come to the phase now where I guess I am in the sort of mid-end, passing on this knowledge, is to be the one who is available to have a landscape, a bird's eye view of the whole field of research clinical care, and be able to plant those ideas in the younger people and then let them run with it. It's like there are brilliant young people out there, and they don't need much. They just need maybe the idea, the suggestion that we as the more senior faculty, we can see the importance of it, and you plant the idea and are there as a supportive role. And that's probably now, looking back on a research career, it's probably one of the most rewarding things that I'm personally involved in now, seeing the younger people that have come up through, taking a little seed that I plant, much like my professor said, why don't you do this? And then sitting back and watching them do it. And it's quite remarkable and very rewarding. I do see research shifting simply because it is so much harder now to get the big grants to do big randomized clinical trials. I'm also a little bit more skeptical about randomized trials now. When I was growing up, it was the end all, the be all and the end all. To do your randomized trial, you do it, you change practice, and everyone will go away and do the next question. But I've come to realize that the application of the results of that trial to practice will probably depend upon the bias of the physician. So if you like the results of the trial, you'll implement it. If you don't like the results of the trial, you probably won't, independent on what kind of trial it is. So a great example of that is Mary Hannah's term breech trial. As soon as it was published, breech delivery worldwide rapidly changed from vaginal to cesarean section because I think people wanted that result. I did a very similar trial on twins, showing that vaginal birth was just as safe as cesarean section. There wasn't an immediate switch from cesarean to vaginal birth. It kind of carried on the same way it was. Now that doesn't mean it's valueless. It could have been without the trial. People who were doing vaginal would have switched to cesareans. We don't know what would have happened. I like to think that, but I'm a little bit more skeptical because it was a 10-year trial. It cost $9 million. So if I were to say what's the future, I would seriously advise people to start becoming expert in quality of care research and translation of what we know into practice in improving quality of care, simply because there's a lot more interest from everybody on improving quality of care. It's not looked at as research, it's looked at as quality of care. In reality, it is research. It's just a different kind of research. I think there's more likely to be funding from government and hospitals because no one can argue with quality of care, but people have a different feeling about research than quality of care. So I think it'll go, and it's also much easier to do because you can do things like time sequence analysis, and you can, in very short time period, you can see whether a quality intervention works. I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that's where the future will go, and that's where I would advise the younger generation to, at least if you're in clinical research, to look at quality of care, perhaps. Not to say we shouldn't give up randomized trials, we should still do them and aim for them. They're still the best evidence we have. So that's my feeling. Well, he is happy. I'm still in close contact with him. His name is Richard Dilford, and he was the professor of obstetrics in Leeds, where I trained in England. And he left clinical medicine, actually, to become one of the advisors of the think tank of the National Health Service, designing the healthcare of the whole of the UK. So, we're still in contact every New Year's. We have a thing every New Year's Eve. We call each other. So, we're still good friends. I think I'd have to say the twin birth study. It was, a huge collaborative grant. It allowed me exposure to colleagues from across the world. It allowed me to tour the world and meet people and who deliver babies. It allowed me to meet women from across the world who participated in the project and value them. It really was a life-changing event. It took 10 years out of my life and resulted in one publication. That's not true. There have been multiple publications from them because of secondary analysis, but the first one was just one publication, so I probably could have produced more papers had I spent 10 years doing other papers. But now the twin birth study it's a once-in-a-lifetime thing. It's never going to be repeated. That would be the thing that I'm certainly most grateful for, because of the assistance that I had in doing it from all my steering committee collaborators, mentors, and also the participants and my peers.